This is 40K Today. Thanks to the new rules, when you're an engagement range of this podcast, you can still operate on your top profile. Hashtag new 40K.
Welcome to 40K Today. My name is Paul Murphy. Today is Friday, July 17th. It is Feel Good Friday. We're going to go over our poll results we've had going up on our Facebook page. The poll asked, in friendly games, will you be implementing the new 10-point rule for painting and basing your entire army? We've had this poll going up on our Facebook page for the last week, and a whopping 67% say absolutely no way. We're not going to count that against our buddies. You know what? Play how you want, but it's nice to see the rule of cool is ruling out. Our first segment this week is about battle damage. Tanya sits down with Jay to get some insight on how he does his wonderful take on these armies.
Thank you for coming on the show, Jay. I've been following your work for a long time, so I'm really excited to have you here.
Thanks. I'm really happy to be here today.
So, how did you get started in the hobby?
That's a great question. I think, like everybody, I have, kind of a story that involves friends, and I had some folks who I hung out with when I was coming out of college, and we were all moving to different places and things like that, and we kind of wanted something that could keep us together. And it turned out that 40K was something that they were interested in, and it's something that I became interested in as soon as I started looking at the models and things like that. Before that, we had played Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons and done all kinds of nerdy stuff. But yeah, 40K kind of became our friend group's niche at that point.
I think that you have a really unique painting style. It's one that I really enjoy, but how would you describe your painting style to others?
I guess for me, the painting style is inspired by a couple of different people online. I really follow Blood Moon Painting and Miniature Alex, who are both great folks on Instagram. But the way that it kind of comes out when it's being, when it's on camera or when you see it on the tabletop, I guess I'd describe it as somewhere between a comic book style and Borderlands, if you're familiar with the console game. And it creates that, that flat sort of coloration, which usually you wouldn't want. You're looking for blends and shading and things like that, but it's sort of an art style that purposefully turns away from those things and makes conscious decisions to lean into the bit more cartoony elements of it. And I think Tau models in general are really excellent for that.
Yeah, I think that I sort of approach miniature painting in the same way, and I refer to my painting style as like crisp, clean, and cell shaded. Um, and I think that we kind of share that together, you and I. But the part that I think is just so awesome is that your Tau, because your Tau is sort of what you're known for, like even the battle damage and the weathering on your Tau is done in this cell shaded style, and it looks awesome. Can you sort of walk us through the process of that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, it's no secret. I've got some tutorials on my Instagram if you're interested in seeing how to do that on specific models. But really, again, going back to that sort of flat style, it involves painting on your base color. I do recess shading for me because I know the weathering is going to be a brown color. I use Rhinox hide for that. I use a brown color for the recess shading. Clean up some of those edges so everything's looking beautiful. And like many artists, you kind of get a model to a point where it's basically ready to go, and then you dirty it up. So all of the battle damage that I do is with a brush. I don't use a sponge or anything like that, which, as you probably can imagine, is incredibly time consuming. But I think the product is really, like, what comes out at the other end is really awesome. And once you have that weathering on the model, so you paint on the brown, still have to go back and do edge highlighting. And I think the part that really makes it look, like you're saying, cell shaded, or, that flattens or posterizes it, is you edge highlight all of the weathering and all of the edges. So you don't just do where things would be lightest, which is what you'll hear other people say in a lot of painting videos. again, it's purposefully ignoring those rules and saying, well, we're gonna edge highlight literally everything. So tons of brush work, tons of brush control are really involved.
I think that's really fascinating, and every time I look at it, I'm like, I'm gonna try it on something, and then I get totally chickened out and I don't do it. But I mean, maybe the time has come for me to give it a try. So one quick last question before I let you go. If you could give any piece of advice to new hobbyists who are just getting started, what would that advice be?
Oh man, there's a lot of advice that circulates around in the community, and there's a couple of things that I think, especially if we're talking about beginners, that are really important. I would say, as far as hobby motivation, don't buy 10 boxes of models at once. I see people on all kinds of places, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna get into Space Marines. Here's my army." For me, that's a mistake. I only buy one box of models at a time because it means I have to finish that box of models before I move on to the next thing. So if you're really motivated, like if you really want to create motivation to paint and you're like, oh man, I really want to paint this repulsor, you're going to have to finish your intercessors before you do that. And especially if you're planning on doing army painting, which, I don't consider myself like a professional painter or anything. I'm more of an army painter. I really need that motivation to churn through the amount of models. But besides that, what kind of happens for me often too is the same thing that I do as a teacher, which is borrow and steal. When you see something that's awesome, take it from somebody, turn it into or put it into your own process and make it kind of happen. Really getting involved in the community has been a huge inspiration for me. So yeah, those would be primarily my two pieces of advice that I think would be helpful for beginners.
Well, that is awesome advice, and probably advice that I should also take, especially regarding buying new models.
It's hard.
But
It's super hard.
yeah, yeah. But thanks so much for coming on this show, Jay. It's been awesome.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Tanya, Jay, thank you very much. Our next segment is JDM talking to Wildman Mark Perry.
Today's episode of 40K Today is brought to you by Frontline Gaming. Frontline Gaming is a one-stop shop for all your Warhammer hobby needs, discounted products, American-made gaming mats and terrain, and a full line of miniatures painting service and daily hobby content. And this can all be found at frontlinegaming.org.
Mark is well known as a tournament beast with innovative list and army design. I can't wait to see what he's up to in 9th edition.
Mark Perry, the beast of the Southeast, joining us on 40K Today. Tell me a little bit about getting better in 9th edition. Obviously, you're an Art of War coach and have been doing a ton with Chaos. So what kind of advice do you have for our listeners out there?
Hey, John, thanks for having me on. And something about Chaos is anytime you're building a Chaos list from the beginning is you got to have a flexible mind. And this is like anytime you're building something that's a new list, there's all kinds of possibilities. And you just kind of have to look at a list from a fundamental level, like, this is what I'm going to do with this list. Here's all the units I want to take. I'll buff them up in these ways. Even if they may be considered bad tier units or just units that you don't use often are considered, you would have to look at them at different lights. Something with Chaos, I would always say, is to experiment and to try something out and use it with a fresh ideas. So
very cool.
That's something that's what I believe deep down inside of my heart. And that's how I play the game when it comes to Chaos.
Okay, so then would you say that in general, you would encourage people, when you say a flexible mind, to be thinking about how to use a lot of different units, I guess, that you normally would not use? Because at least in Chaos, and actually this works across all of 40K, right? There's a lot of sometimes synergies where the sum is greater than the parts.
Correct. So that's one of the things where it comes down to you have to understand what that unit's job and goal is, and what it is for that matchup or however the game is, or how your strategy is built around your list. And that's something you sit there and say, here's one thing that does this, here's another thing that does a similar thing, but little differences. And that's where you have to ask yourself, hey, look, in the situation I'm going to be most of the time in, which one's better? And then you have to also understand that your opponent may not understand what is sometimes those best situations. And that's where your job is playing in there. An example is coming up this week, I'm going to be bringing Mutilators and Emperor's Children's List. But I'm not bringing Mutilators as because they're one of the worst units in the game. I'm not bringing it as a hard-hitting counter assault or like going to go in there and just kill my opponent. I'm bringing it in for screens because they're very cheap going in the 9th edition, and they're very like compared for durability. They're actually pretty durable points per wounds. And the Honor of the Prince allows them to do those type of different plays with this faction. That's like this unit that's considered very subpar. It's probably one of the worst ones in the game. But all the roles that I want to do with it, I'm finding success with.
Okay, so you would say that you think that flexibility and trying lots of different things in your army to figure out what works for you is probably the way to go, and then you use that to sort of inform your decisions as you start honing in on what works. So maybe for 9th edition, would you describe it as throwing, Jello on the wall and see what sticks, that kind of thing?
A little bit like that. I also sit there. Like there's a play style in every single person, and to understand what they want to do as a player, find those units that, hey, look, here's my game strategy. And in addition, this may still be my game strategy. Am I a combo player? Am I an aggressive player? Am I a passive? Am I very defensive? Finding those units that do to your personal strategy, to your style, and to show off your strengths is what I find is very important.
Okay, that's really cool. Let me ask you, what's your impression of 9th edition? Like, what do you think is going to be good? Where do you think there's room to grow? Like, how is it going to be different than, say, 8th edition?
So I think comparing 9th to 8th is almost like comparing like 5th and 6th, possibly a little bit, to 8th. Where in this game, I feel like it's going to be very much more tactical, not so much strategical, where sometimes you just win games because of the matchup and you have to full out there. Where this one, there's a lot more smaller engagements and a lot more less units, where the game feels a little bit more squad-based, and placing those little units tactically best is one of the strongest things how to win the game. Also, very tough OBSEC. Fighting on objectives is where the 9th edition I'm really enjoying because it makes so many interesting positioning plays very, very fun to me, but also very interesting for just how could I have done this better? How could he have done this better? How does my list focus on these objectives, say I want to fight these objectives, I want to keep these objectives? And they're causing these really good battles because how important it is to control the objectives and how in your face you and your opponent have to be to a certain degree to win the game.
Yeah, because you tell me if I'm wrong, but like this sit back and pound your army, their army with artillery, you'll just lose on primary.
You'll lose on primary. You may sometimes have some terms where if someone just runs onto you, you'll get 5 or 0 points on it, and you just can't afford that.
Yeah, no, it's really tough because you only get 4 scoring turns. So let's
Correct.
Right, because you don't score on turn 1, and there's only 5 turns in the game.
Yep.
And since you only score for 4 turns, if you take 2 turns off of not scoring, like you get so far behind. Like you have to be participating in the game.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that I always think is really good is the fact that you don't score the objectives during your turn, you score them during your next turn. So you're always being forced to think a step ahead.
Yeah. Actually, I hadn't really thought about that, but I suppose that's a really good tip too. You're going to have to be sort of not necessarily planning for this turn, which is always important, but also planning for what's going to happen during your opponent's turn, because you need to be able to predict where your guys are going to survive and where they're going to die, because you have to set up to score those primary points.
Exactly, bro.
Very cool. All right. Well, thanks for the tips, Mark. We really appreciate it, and we'll be in touch soon.
Bye.
Mark and John, thanks a lot for that tip, helping us stay ahead of the game. It's been a long time since we talked about Xenos, and that's exactly what we're doing in today's Model of the Day.
It's the model of the day, the model of the day, the model of the day.
Today's model is brought to us by Daughter of Cain on Instagram. This is a beautiful Necron Wraith. It's like it's crawling out of the lava and the base reflects that. It's some brilliant OSL. You really see the skeletal structure of the Wraith pick out. You know, folks sometimes skimp out on the Necrons, but they can be an absolute canvas for artistic and special effects, and this miniature does not disappoint. I really love the dynasty choice, the color choice, the boldness of the highlights, and the glow effect. Keep doing what you're doing. This is an amazing miniature. Check them out on Instagram, Daughter of Cain. Bum, bum, bum. That's it for today, but not for the whole week. Check us out tomorrow for a best of episode. You can find it on the Frontline Gaming Network or in your favorite podcast player. A big thanks to our content producer, Alex Bainter, Tanya Gates, as always, for social media, and Seamus Ronan for the hard work putting all this thing together on the technical side. For Steve, John, and myself, Paul Murphy, we will see you next week. Thanks for joining us. That's what's happening in 40K today.